Dr. Edwin Vermulst and Professor Petros Mavroidis. I don't need to explain to you. Probably most of you are quite familiar with these names. Although this is probably the first time for you to actually meet this person in person. So, okay, the time is the most valuable resource today, so I will not spend too much time on that. If you go to the web page, internet site, then there are numerous pages to explain about this to eminent scholar. So you can refer to that. Today, they will begin this seminar with the short presentations. And then if time is allowed, then I will probably have some question for them. And then I will spare the time for you. So please prepare your questions to them, and then I will do my best to give more chance to the people. In addition to these two scholars, we actually have two other the eminent guests from Europe. So later, I hope we can have a chance to share their insight as well on the relevant questions. Okay then, who are ready?
He's the author.
Okay.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay, I go over there. Huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you want me to speak first about? The WTO
And the mic
or
is
the
working.
section 1 to 2? You decide.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Okay.
Professor Dukgeun, thank you very much for the invitation. It's nice to be back in Seoul National University. I was here a couple of years ago, I think even in the same room maybe, with my daughter at the time. This time I didn't bring her, but it's nice to be back. And during my presentation I'm going to talk about recent trends in the EU Common Commercial Policy as a result of geo-economic developments. You can all hear me, I hope? Yeah? Okay. So I have three items today. The first is the EU position. I'm from the EU, from Brussels in Belgium. So I'm going to focus on the EU position in this presentation. So the first item is the EU position in the WTO discussions. We had some discussions during previous days with the Korean government officials, and it seems that in Korea the atmosphere about the WTO is quite pessimistic. I think in Europe it is a bit more moderate, and the EU still sees itself as a strong supporter of the WTO, but it recognizes that the WTO has to be changed. So the EU position is to preserve the WTO, but to transform it so that it can better respond to geo-economic realities, competition and non-market distortions, which is the term that the EU uses basically against China. And the EU made a submission on a reform of the WTO in January 2026, and there they focused on three items: predictability, fairness and flexibility. So these were, in the view of the EU, three items where the EU has to improve. In terms of predictability, the EU considers that the WTO must remain rules-based. It must remain based on rules. But the reformed system must be underpinned by a fully functioning and effective dispute settlement system. And even in today's trade turmoil, the WTO rules still provide a basic floor of legal certainty. So that is the starting point for the predictability. What does that mean in practice? Well, the EU was actively involved. It was one of the key drivers to establish the MPIA as an interim solution now that the appellate body doesn't function anymore or has not functioned anymore for several years. And the MPIA covers 58 WTO members, and it covers close to 60% of world trade. Of course, especially the United States, is not a member. Even in Korea is not a member, unfortunately. And personally, I still hope that will change, but I'm not too hopeful. having heard what some Korean government officials think about it. Then the second pillar is fairness. And in the view of the EU, the WTO rules must reflect changed economic realities. And the EU wants to address imbalances in the rights and commitments of members and strengthen level playing field rules. And the third pillar is flexibility. And with that, the EU means that that consensus-based multilateralism alone is no longer enough. So there must be possibilities for more flexible governance, including plurilaterals and variable geometry approaches. So the EU must become more flexible. Members of the WTO that want to move ahead must be able to move ahead even if some members don't agree with moving ahead. So why did the EU position change? Well, the EU now sees the system under strain from industrial policy, from state intervention, from overcapacity, from digital trade, climate issues and resilience concerns. So these are all elements that in the view of the EU have changed over time during the past 20 years and that the WTO in its current system cannot adequately address. So the reform of the WTO must therefore be linked to broader geo-economic concerns like the level playing field and the risk of fragmentation. So that is the first item. So what is the EU doing in the meantime? In the meantime, the EU focuses, like many other countries, on negotiating FTAs, free trade agreements. And in the EU, we have a lot of free trade agreements. We have nearly 50 FTAs. We have an FTA with Korea, of course, which has been very successful, I think, from both the Korean and the EU perspective. And the EU is still seeking to lock in new deals. Especially since 2024, so during the past 2-3 years, the EU has intensified its FTA agenda as part of its broader economic security strategy. And the objective of the EU is not only market access, which tended to be the traditional FTAs, but also to improve diversification, resilience and geopolitical positioning of the EU with like-minded countries. So what does this mean? Diversification means that the EU wants to expand agreements with partners such as India, Indonesia and the Mercosur countries. Mercosur, as I think you know, is Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay. In order to help the EU to reduce overdependence on a small number of suppliers and export destinations. So the more FTAs we have in the EU, the more we can diversify our supply chain. In terms of resilience, it overlaps a bit. FTAs can strengthen supply chain security by improving access to raw materials and alternative production hubs when disruptions affect existing trade routes. And in terms of geopolitical positioning, the EU wants to deepen trade ties with strategically important partners, allowing it to reinforce its presence in key regions and to promote EU rules, standards and partnerships in response to global power competition. So the 3 recent agreements that the EU has concluded are with Mercosur, Indonesia and India, and both of these took a long time to negotiate. Mercosur, I think, took more than 20 years, but over the past 3 years it has really sped up very quickly. So Mercosur is now agreed, Indonesia has been agreed, India has been agreed. It still is subject in the EU, which is a very complicated process, to ratification by the 27 EU member states. But in general, some parts of the FTAs can move ahead, while other parts of EU FTAs need ratification of EU member state governments. But the text has basically been agreed, so it's a question of time before they will enter into force fully. Beyond these big 3 FTA agreements that have been agreed, the EU has also initiated FTA talks with the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the EU has concluded a Sustainable Investment Facilitation Agreement with Ecuador. I'm not sure why that's very important, but it has concluded that agreement. Then finally, because you might get the impression from the previous two slides that the EU is all in favor of free trade, and to some extent that is true, but also in recognition of the fact that other partners are not, especially the United States, of course, the EU has been perhaps forced or perhaps found a convenient excuse to become more protectionist too. And I'll give you some examples of that in the next slides, but these are just examples. Overall, the EU has clearly become more protectionist in many areas. In general, the EU becomes protectionist through regulation. But beyond regulation, there are also border measures that the EU imposes and that also limit imports. But regulation is a very powerful tool that the EU has to try to keep countries or exports that it does not like, to keep them out of the EU market. And of course the EU, I think you know, politically the EU does not account for much, but in terms of economics it is a huge market, right? It's one of the biggest markets in the world. So people want to have access. So then what do we have? First of all, and perhaps most notable, we have a new regime to deal with steel. Steel for the past 8 years was subject to a safeguard measure. The EU very rarely imposes safeguard measures, but on steel we have had 2 times a safeguard measure, once in the early 2000s and then during the past 8 years. But that safeguard measure expires in the end of June of this year, so next month. And the safeguard measure has a maximum duration of 8 years. It cannot be extended. There's a cooling off period. So the EU had to do something else to prevent steel imports from flooding the EU market. And what the EU has done is far worse than the safeguard measure that it had over the past 8 years, because it has basically used Article 28 of the GATT to renegotiate its tariff bindings on steel products. And steel, I'm talking about steel, but there are many steel products, right? So it's a huge market. And now, as of 1 July, the EU will come up with what we call the post-SG. SG stands for safeguard. The post-SG steel regime. And under that new regime, which replaces the safeguard measure that was into force, or that will be into force until the end of the month, with a new system where we have a tariff-free quota. So this is a quota, and as long as you're in the quota, you don't have to pay additional tariffs. But the quota is very small. It's 18.3 million tons. And that's a 47% reduction compared with the 2024 safeguard quotas. So we had these quotas for 8 years, but the new regime will cut down those quotas by almost half. And once the quota is reached, the EU will impose a 50% duty, which applies across the board to all steel imports, compared with the 25% duty that applied under the current safeguard measure. So the quota becomes much smaller, and the duty, once the quota is reached, becomes much higher. This new system was voted upon yesterday by the European Parliament, which was kind of the last step. And the European Parliament overwhelmingly approved this new system. So it is now beyond doubt that that new system will enter into force. But one issue which is still very problematic is how is the quota going to be split up, right? Because you have a quota, you can have a global quota, but you can also have a country-specific quota. And if you have country-specific quotas, the question is, who's going to get what? So what the EU plans to do, but this is still being negotiated as far as I know, is that there will be a basic quota for everybody. Then FTA partners of the EU, including Korea, including Japan, but including many other countries, will get something special on top of the basic quota. And then there will be a third tranche of the quota, which will be divided among the FTA partners. But this is still being negotiated. And this new steel regime is justified by what the EU considers to be structural global overcapacity in the market. And although the EU does not say it in so many words, obviously the main overcapacity in the view of the EU is taking place in China. A big question is whether this post-safeguard steel regime will become a model for other uncompetitive industrial sectors, for example, chemicals, because the chemical industry in the EU is also suffering very badly at the moment because the costs of energy are so high in the EU. So other sectors are saying, now that the EU has come forward with this extra protection for steel, other sectors are saying, we want that kind of protection too. Okay. Now, the big difference with the US, of course, is that the EU is at least trying to do it in a WTO-conform manner. They're using Article 28 to renegotiate the tariffs, and that means also that countries that are hurt by this new measure should be able to get compensation in other areas. So at least the EU is trying to do it in a WTO-compatible manner. I think that's an important point that we have to give the EU credit for. Next, then, the question is whether the EU should move towards a broader overcapacity instrument, and this is going to be discussed at the end of the month by the European Commission with the 27 EU member states. And there was a study by the European Parliament of April 2026, so last month, which argues that traditional trade defense instruments, dumping, subsidies, safeguard measures, are no longer sufficient. So they should be complemented by a sector-specific protection, a much broader instrument that allows the EU to apply trade restrictive measures for sectors. When you have dumping or subsidy cases, they are very targeted. You have to target a specific product. But with a sector instrument, you can protect the whole sector at once, right? So that's going to be, again, a major, that will be a major distinction. And the idea is that this broad new instrument should focus on areas, on sectors where there are overcapacities, but there are many sectors with overcapacities these days. And in Europe we have an association of EU industries, a bit similar to KITA in Korea, but more specifically industries that use trade protective measures very actively. It's called AGIS. And this is a very powerful organization that is pushing hard for this sector instrument. And the idea would be that it should be triggered by an EU industry, chemicals, aluminum, maybe cars. It would be independent of safeguards, so it would be, in addition to a safeguard instrument, it would apply beyond steel. And it should allow for punitive border tariffs or equivalent measures, like, for example, quotas. Then the EU is also moving more and more into regulatory restrictions, as I mentioned before, and there are two areas that come to mind, or two initiatives that come to mind. One is called the Net Zero Industry Act, the NZIA, as we call it, and the second is the Industrial Accelerator Act, the IAA. And both of these contain local content requirements, which is very unusual in the EU. In the US, we've had the Buy American legislation for a long time, but in the EU, basically, we did not have local content requirements in the past. But that is changing now. And the NZIA is still relatively okay, but the IAA would be very blatantly arguing for local content. So what does this NZIA do? The NZIA contains mandatory resilience criteria in procurement and renewable energy auctions. So it focuses on renewable energy sources, solar, wind turbines, those kind of technologies. And it would be triggered where one non-EU country covers over 50% of EU demand for a given technology. So I'm sure you can guess, for example, if we take solar panels, what is the country that has the biggest solar panel production in the world? Of course, it's China, right? Wind turbines, of course, it's China. So China is not mentioned, but it's completely clear that the country targeted by this instrument is China. And then if that is the case for a certain product, then the NZIA will have resilience criteria which favor diversification away from that dominant supplier or from that dominant industry, and therefore it can operate de facto as an EU preference mechanism or as a mechanism giving preference to third countries other than China. The resilience criteria apply to at least 30% of the auction volume, and they count for 15 to 30% of the score. What that means, to keep it very simple, is that of course China is also very cheap, right? That's why it has been so successful. So the bids from China tend to be the cheapest normally, but then they will get kind of a negative score of 15 to 30%. So that means that they should be at least 15 to 30% more than that. They should be cheaper more than that 15 to 30%, okay, than the bids from other suppliers. The proposed IAA, the Industrial Accelerator Act, it has not yet entered into force. It was proposed in the beginning of the year. And that goes even further by introducing made in the EU and EU origin requirements in public procurement and certain public support schemes for strategic sectors. And again, renewable energy is a big element there. And the current proposal, which is made by the European Commission, it still has to go in what we call the trilogue, the discussions with the European Parliament and with the member states. But what the EU Commission is proposing is that foreign ownership in these sectors, if you want to invest in the EU, would be kept at 49%. So that means that the majority should be EU owned. At least 50% of the workers should be EU citizens. And at least 30% of the inputs should be EU sourced or should be EU based, should have EU origin. So this is just a proposal, but just last month there was kind of a precursor where the Commission had agreed with the European financial institutions, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EIB, basically the European banking institutions, that no funding should be provided anymore to inverters. Inverters are used, for example, in solar panels, right? Or in wind turbines, or in systems that are used in battery energy storage systems, if they are made in what the EU calls high-risk countries. So what are the high-risk countries? There are 4 of them identified by the Commission: China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. So there are 4 countries, but who is producing solar panels? It's China, right? Who is producing wind turbines? It's China. Who is producing these battery storage systems of the 4 countries? It's China again. So again, these measures, although they apply in theory to the 4 high-risk countries, in reality the only country that will be affected is China. So this relates to public funding, right? So the question is, does that violate the WTO rules? Public funding means it's government procurement, right? We have an agreement, the GPA, which is a WTO agreement on public procurement, but China is not a member. So can China complain about this informal guidance? It's not published. It was discovered by a journalist from the South China Morning Post, and he published an article. He had a scoop on that. So the EU Commission was forced to admit that they had issued this guidance to the European banks, but there's nothing on paper. And still it has not been made public exactly what it is and to what it applies. But it exists for sure, and the banks are already applying it as of last month. So that means if you're a Chinese producer of inverters or energy storage systems, you cannot benefit anymore from public funding. Now, you may say, okay, so what? There's many private investments too, but actually in this sector, because we're not talking about consumers who put solar panels on their roof, we're talking about solar parks, or we're talking about wind turbine parks. And there are massive investments in that sector because it is a priority in the EU to invest in renewable energies, and there is massive public support from the European banks for these sectors. So, and is the WTO inconsistent? I think it depends how you look at it, because there are other non-risk countries which also are not members of the GPA, but they are not covered by this, right? So I think that's perhaps where the discrimination is. It is not between GPA members and non-GPA members, but it would be between non-GPA members, where some of them can benefit from public support and others cannot. I'm mindful of the time, so this is my last slide. And that is more the traditional instruments that I mentioned before: anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, and safeguard actions. So these are the instruments that the EU has used traditionally over the last 40, maybe 50 years to protect its market. And so there's not that much new there, except for the fact that there are many more cases. So in 2024, which was the most recent year that the EU publicly reported on, there were 33 new investigations, which was a record. It was more than 3 times higher than the average. And of those 33 investigations, 29 were anti-dumping, 3 AS, and 3 anti-subsidy cases, and 1 was a safeguard. So this is the highest number in a year since 2006. China, again, is by far the most targeted country, with around 85 EU measures in force against Chinese imports by the end of 2024. But Korea is after a long period where there were not many trade cases against Korea. In recent years, the EU has started relatively many trade cases against Korea too, particularly in the chemical sector. And the reason why there are many cases in that sector is because the EU is uncompetitive, because chemicals need a lot of energy, and the energy costs in the EU, mostly because of the war in Ukraine, are 4 times higher in Europe than in the rest of the world. So it's very difficult for European chemical industries to compete with industries in other countries. I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thank you very much.
So now,
Want to go there?
yeah, now is the chance for Petros.
Hai fatto bene. Audio su, you have to find it. Excellent, you look great. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for the invite. Your professor and me, we've been overlapping over the years. We have both very strong Michigan connection. I admire his work in law and economics of trade policy, and I hope we'll continue to overlap and cross paths in the future as well. It's a real pleasure for me to be in Seoul one more time and discuss with you where we are nowadays. I'll be brief. This is where I want to end. I want to end here to show you that there is a proliferation of economic measures which threaten the continued policy relevance of a WTO. And I want to ask 2 questions. First, why is the WTO ill-equipped to deal with economic security? And second, well, why are we suddenly discussing economic security? Why was it not an issue ever before? So to do this, it's difficult to go to the ultimate cause, but we can go to the proximate cause. And the proximate cause is the US trade policy. Forget now the past. IEEPA came and went. The Supreme Court decided it's illegal, in my view, rightly so. But this was not the end of the day. Immediately thereafter, President Trump imposed the Section 122 tariffs, which represent a huge cost for the world trading community. Now, the US shifts cost to the rest of the world. You can expect, of course, the cost to the world to react. But it's not just that. It is the way the whole thing was done raised issues also inside the US. The court, well, so first of all, what is the Section 122? I don't know, have you discussed those things before at all? Section 122 in US, here, in the class?
Briefly.
Briefly, okay. And just the main parts. This is an instrument which allows the president, so the power of the person in the US is with the Congress, not with the president. But this instrument allows the president in extraordinary situations to impose a tariff for 150 days up to 15%. Now, why does this instrument exist? Because there was no such instrument in the 60s. So when the Nixon shock came in 1971, Nixon had to use the Trade with the Enemy Act to address a severe balance of payments problem. Following the Nixon shock, the US enacted this Section 122. But this is for balance of payments. It's not to address trade deficit. Now, these are two different things. Trade deficit, you look just into the trade, imports minus exports. Trade balance of payments, you look into everything, investment and so on and so forth. Well, some people in the US were upset. And as of 2 weeks ago, the Court of International Trade, in a very detailed decision, made exactly this point. President, you misused your powers. You misused Section 122. Misusing Section 122 means you have to stop imposing those tariffs, and those who lost money can go back and request money from the US government. Now, requesting money in the US, this is a short digression, is not so easy because of a case law by the Supreme Court, the CASA case, which allows, let's say that Professor Ryan and myself, who have a company in Wisconsin, and we take the case there, well, we can take our money as far as imports into Wisconsin are concerned. But if we have a branch in California, we have to go to the California court again, and so on and so forth. The transaction costs of litigation are quite high. But all this to say that this is an instrument which now under US law, WTO hasn't spoken about it. I'll say one word in a moment. All this to say that under US law, these are deemed illegal, so the president has to stop imposing Section 122 tariffs. Just a short digression now. In the WTO, I couldn't believe my eyes actually when I read it. They discuss it in the Professor Dr. Charles Cantore used to work in the WTO legal service for years. They discuss it in the context of the Balance of Payments Committee, when the US court said this is not a balance of payments issue at all. Now, I don't know what the discussion will look like over there, but let's see. Now, you would expect this to be the end of the story. No, it was not, because President Trump, who likes tariffs, had already initiated investigations under Section 301, another instrument in the US. Now, this instrument we were discussing with your professor a couple of days ago, for years, when we were kids at the end of the 80s, it used to have specific targets. India, very often. Japan, very often. Brazil, these were the three main targets of the US. Now they use it across the board. The best example is, this is just to explain how it works, mandatory discretionary. If you don't care very much about this, this is what you care about. They have 60 countries targets, accusing them for forced labor. And I have seen no assessment so far, but at Columbia Law School where I work, my labor lawyer friends with who I emailed, they're doing the research now, they tell me maybe there is one plausible case. If we take the ILO definition of force, the international standard. Now, how it will be applied, only God knows. All this to say that we are in a world where, because of the actions of this particular administration, costs have shifted to the world community, and now the world community has to react. That's as far as the proximate cause is concerned. Ultimate cause we can discuss later. Now, when we say react, how can you react? Forget theory, let's move into practice. And that's the second bullet point. I've seen three reactions. One is industrial policy. So Korea says, for example, well, these guys, they impose Section 122 tariffs on my exports. I will now subsidize those companies that lose money to make up for the lost income. That's one way to do it. there are no silos. You can do a combination of, I'll tell you what happened in the real world. The other is I can retaliate. I tell the US, you want to play hardball? I can play hardball as well. And the third is preferential integration. You say I lose my market in the US, well, I integrate with someone else and I divert my exports to this market. In the real world, option 2, only one exercised it. China. Why? Because if you want to retaliate, you have to find your choke points, where you're persuasive, where you can deter the US. Now, to do that, you need to look into the sectors where you have a dominant position. This must be sectors with very low substitutability, because if Korea has 85% of the world milk market, who cares? The moment Korea raises its prices, anyone can produce milk and move into that market. But if Korea produces high-end semiconductors, well, then there is an issue. So not only dominant position, but also low substitutability. And equally importantly, asymmetry in the costs, because anytime you impose countermeasures, as you know from your economics classes, these are costly for the party imposing those measures as well. It's some sort of predation argument. Say I have a price, let's say in equilibrium is here, I impose countermeasures, I lose money, because you eventually expect to increase my prices and make up all the money lost. Well, to do all of this, you have to see somehow, you have to make your calculus. How much money will I lose? How much money will I win? I expect to win eventually. China did it, and China is the only one who imposed retaliatory measures against the US. Why China? Because China has over 85% in commercial exploitation of rare earths. Picked a couple of rare earths like neodymium, which is important for the production of magnets, where China's cost was something like 2 billion, according to calculations that saw the light of day finally, but was imposing a cost of 600 billion on the US, totally asymmetric. So you need dominant position, low substitutability in this sector, and asymmetric effects. Only one country managed to have all three, China, and they did it. And the US changed. So this is not for everyone either. And preferential integration, well, how far can you go with that? Preferential integration, who with who? Maybe Korea can do it. It's a very wealthy country with like-minded players, might decide to join CPTPP, God knows. But this is not for the smaller and poorer players. It's not an option at all. And by the way, no matter which option you take, either you adopt an illegal measure, I'll explain in a moment, or sometimes you cannot even address the real problem. Why illegal? Industrial policies, some subsidies are illegal. You cannot do local content. You cannot do export subsidies. So if Korea wants to help its domestic producers, it has to be local content one way or the other. So this is out of the question. But people do it, of course. Retaliate, you can never retaliate unless if you go to a WTO panel. You must get authorization. The whole idea of the DSU in the WTO was to avoid unilateral measures. And preferential integration, I have one co-author forever, a Swedish economist. We checked once and we stopped checking, you'll see why in a moment, in 2010, the consistency of agreements signed by Europe and the US, the two main hubs for preferential integration, to our mind, for whatever our views, our opinion is worth, there was not one which passed the test of substantial legal trade, as explained in the negotiations of Article 24, renegotiations, and the Australian proposal 1994. Not one. So essentially you say, well, whatever I do, I will do it. I'll help I have a plausible objective. I want economic security. Who doesn't subscribe to that? But I don't have the means to do it. There are no legal means in the WTO now to achieve this objective, and nations exercise the outside option. And that's the biggest problem. So we have the US government behaving the way it does. The affected parties rationally want to buy economic security, but to do that, they have to use illegalities. And that's the feeder loop, which makes the WTO less and less and less relevant. So why is the WTO unarmed? And with this, I will stop my remarks. It's very interesting. I mean, if you look at the economic history of trade integration, there were discussions about it because the negotiators of the GATT, 1946-48, they were mindful of the literature. They knew Hirschman, they knew Weiner. They knew that when you open trade, of course it's welfare enhancing, but you open up to vulnerabilities as well. I start becoming dependent on supplies or for my exports. Can cut both ways. And they did include some provisions to address that in Chapter 5 of the ITO, the International Trade Organization. But the ITO never saw the light of day, and the GATT was left unarmed. There was no issue between 46 and 94 because the GATT was both trade and security agreement. It was the winners of the Second World War who were market economies and who were in a situation of Cold War with the Soviet Union satellites. No GATT member had an interest in weakening the trade alliance between them. So nobody weaponized trade. 1994, when the WTO sees the light of day, you would expect some change in principle. But people were swayed by the fall of the Berlin Wall. They thought the world had changed. From now on, we're all liberal market economies, blah, 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 blah. That was proved not to be the case. And the WTO was unarmed. So the only way you could advance economic security is through imaginative interpretations of existing obligations. In a way, the US tried to do it in its cases, or the wrong cases in my view, but that's we can discuss later, concerning Steel 232 a little bit, where Professor Cantore wrote the reports, and he can tell you lots about those things. He's been criticized because the reports are, and justly so. The WTO consistent case law has closed the door to this possibility, once and for all. You can use this provision for cases when you adopt measures in times of war or warlike situations. So the last possible, let's say, platform to advance economic security was closed not by the law itself, but the way the law was completed through case law. Case law made it impossible. So these guys now, everybody who is affected, and who, of course, I mean, if you're a responsible government, you must take care of your economic security. You can do it only in one way, through illegalities. But when you do it through illegalities, the victim is not just the US or others who lose access to your market, it's the system itself. And this is where we are, in a terrible equilibrium. Predicament of WTO is in a terrible predicament, and quite frankly, we can discuss later. I'll just give you with one thought the best papers I have seen discussing, theoretical papers in economics discussing to what extent we can still come back and save the WTO. They're very, 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 very skeptical because there is no hegemon to have the incentive to put these structures in place. You have three dominant players with very high coordination costs between them. They will never get together. Not even the EU and the US agree on the most important things. And I'll stop with this for now, then we can discuss more.